Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Local Film Talk. I'm your host, Bob Walters, and we are here again covering the local filmmaking scene and talking to different people about what they're working on around here. We're doing something different this time. We are actually talking with Melissa Dollman and Devin Orgeron about some archival footage they've been going through. Can you guys, first of all, thank you for being on the show.
Oh, thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
So what this is you guys are actually going to be doing first a screening and then an exhibit at the Hunt Library at NC State. The screening is October 13th, and then the exhibit goes through November, about a production company called Century Film Productions that was located here in Raleigh back from the 60s to the 80s, I guess. And Melissa, you're an archivist and came across all this footage that they had shot, and you've been going through it. Can you tell us a little bit about what you found and the company that made it?
Sure. There was this local cameraman, Obie Garris. I did not know that he had a history in local television production here, but he donated in around 85. He donated just a couple of boxes of films to the state archives. And a couple of years ago, they needed somebody who had the skills to process the films. And by that means put them on reels, looking through the loop, inspecting them and cleaning it and fixing splices. And then finally, as best as you can, because we didn't know if these were one-off materials or not, meaning like, is this the only film in existence of this thing? And so you can't just throw it on a projector and watch it just in case. And it turns out that was a really great method to inspect first, because these were campaign films for governors who won, governors who didn't win, the Governor Holshouser's entire inauguration and parade, lots of Democrats, Republicans. It was just really cameraman and production company for hire. And I moved to North Carolina in 2013, and so I didn't know who any of these people were. So that was really, really fun for me.
The politicians.
To who any politicians or anybody in the collection. So I would just stop and say, like, well, this has got to be somebody important. And then I would just start doing Google image searches and try to match up people. And every once in a while there'd be some titles, some text or something.
In the initial stages of this too, just to make it clear, we're fairly labor intensive. Melissa was looking at 16 millimeter film with basically a light source and a magnifying glass and trying to figure out what she was looking at before actually submitting it to, some projectors are quite gentle, but if the film's damaged in any way, it'll eat it up. And so making sure the film is in good enough shape to get to run through a projector, or if necessary, get the proper care that it needed, so that we could eventually make copies that we could show for the event.
Yeah, because a lot of the first initial questions people will ask is like, well, what was it on video, or did you just take it all and digitize it all? And that's quite expensive. And so I did end up writing a preservation grant for a couple of the films in the collection, because I thought they were pretty amazing. And they were in such poor shape. One of them I just thought was audio. It had so much mold on it, I couldn't tell what it was. And then I sent it off, and they were like, this is the entire campaign ad for Bob Scott running for lieutenant governor. Because we had one that was just the image but not the sound. And I was like, oh, well, this must be the sound element. And I'm pretty good at identifying that stuff. And I was like, but it was so corroded, I didn't want to take it apart, because then you could strip, emotion and the image right off the films. And so I just was like, here, just take the whole thing.
Tell us what you find.
Tell us what you find. And they were like, it's an entire ad. So it ended up just being this really fascinating collection all the way through. And that one I knew would probably be a hit with the National Film Preservation Foundation, because it had like Bob Hope, and I now understand the Miss America 1973. I knew she looked like a beauty queen of some kind. I now know that's who that was. And I didn't know that it was Obie Garris's family too, as the cinematographer. Well, that he put his own family in the film, but that's further down the story.
So, and also interestingly, the other film that was restored was the Fair film, right? What was wrong with that one? Was it the color? on it?
It was, yeah, right. So there was this beautiful original A and B rolls, and then all there was kind of crappy faded magenta print of it. And so I was like, why would you want to have a crappy magenta print of a state fair? You know, like, and to have these really great people. So because the original elements were pretty unblemished and really, really beautiful, I thought, well, they can put this back together, and it'll look really,
and it looks gorgeous,
and it looks really beautiful. Yeah, so I was pretty excited about that. So so it was just boxes of films, going through them, and then just turning out like, this is Dan K. Moore, and this is Governor Hodges, and this is this guy who didn't win, and this is, who are just
and also weird things too. I mean, things that have nothing to do with political campaigns, like advertising film reels for Mount Olive pickles, some advertising campaigns for what I'm told is it was a legendary record store in the Triangle in I guess the 70s and 80s,
60s, 70s, and 80s.
A place called the Record Bar. So we found some of their advertisements. Police training films, two of those. I think. So this is a really busy company, and a company that was producing all sorts of material at a time when small companies like this were kind of the standard. I mean, there were at least two small production companies that I know of in Raleigh at the time. And Klein, the Klein family. They were here and then moved to Charlotte. Mm-hmm. And so there, this was kind of how this material got made prior to the coming of video in the 1980s. There was, and a lot of this stuff, a lot of the campaigns that they were working on, they weren't just local campaigns. A lot of the stuff that they were working on were for, firms that were outside of the state or outside of town. And so they were a really, a very busy company.
Yeah. And something that I discovered that I told you I wanted to show your fans was this guy who wrote a memoir. He's written a few memoirs. His name's Grady Jeffries, but it's a strange spelling of Jeffries, like Jeffer Y-S. Anyway, he worked for WNAO and WRAL, and O.B. Garris basically worked. He was a cameraman for those two television stations, WNAO being the first in the area. Right. And then he was a cameraman for them. And then I think as I found documentation, like phone book documentation, and also in talking to his daughter, that he started Century Studios about 1957. So people started jumping ship from WNAO because of things that this guy goes into. WRAL, but at the same time as well, he kind of started this production company on his own. And what this guy talks about is he also made films. So I need to find this guy and see if he's still alive. He wrote this like 2 years ago. Is that advertising agencies? He went from WRAL to JT Howard and Associates, which became McKinney in town, in the area, and they would go to politicians and say, we can do this whole production project for you for your campaign, from both the
from soup to nuts.
Exactly.
Did the video and the whole marketing campaign.
That's right.
Yeah, and that includes films that we can now, because we all have ins, because this guy worked at WRL, we all have ins at the television station, so we can totally put your stuff on the air.
Okay.
Yeah. But yeah.
So what we've got here from Century Films and O.B. Garris is basically like a time capsule, like all these historical records of stuff that happened back then. So you were talking about how you were telling me earlier about why these companies came into being and what the benefit was for them based on the way the laws were set up with airtime and everything. Can you tell the our viewers, listeners, however they may be experiencing this, how, what the incentive was for all these little production companies?
Absolutely. Well, one of the kind of historical oddities, if you look back at sort of the era post-war, but really this took shape in the 1960s and 1970s, is that there were laws in place that required the networks to dedicate a certain amount of time every day, airtime, to educational material, educational broadcasts. And what that meant, and it was kind of, if you think about it, it was kind of a loophole. I mean, there were some, I don't want to suggest that companies like Century were illegitimate, but there were, I would say, kind of more traditionally educationally focused kinds of programming. Sesame Street comes to mind. Like that's, I think that's sort of but it opened up a sort of category for
educational can be interpreted pretty broadly.
That's exactly it. And so these companies who were previously charged with making advertisements and campaign films realized that they had a kind of opening for creating essentially free advertising for companies that were shrewd enough to think of their sort of corporate profile in semi-educational tones, right? Like, so presenting things in a way that would also educate / indoctrinate the viewer was a kind of new way of doing business, and a really interesting way of doing business. And I think it's, if we've only done the research on a couple of companies in the area in North Carolina, but it's just a fact that these kinds of companies existed in every state in the union during this era, and that research remains to be done. And so one of the things I'm super fascinated in is just finding out who were the Century Film Studios in Arizona or New Mexico or Colorado or other states.
They had to be there.
Yeah.
As soon as the stations kept popping up all over the country.
Yep. Right. And it's sort of a weird concept to people nowadays, when you think of the internet. I mean, even just TV has thousands of channels now. It's kind of hard for people to think back to a time, not just without the internet, but all you had were your three networks, your three major national networks, and whatever local affiliates there were at the time of what did you say it was, WNAO?
That
which
was
later became WRAL. They were the only local station in the area.
Yeah, actually, I'm learning a lot about that. Is that WNAO actually, and someone had to point this out to me. NAO is N&O, the News and Observer. That company is who started it. And for whatever reason, and they were a UHF station, and so without going into a lot of background about television history,
Yankovic movie, kids.
Yeah, exactly. WRAL came to town, and they got the coveted VHF, which meant that they could pull in the network shows, and they had a contract with I guess it was NBC. I'm blanking for a second. And that's why
they started out with NBC. I mean, obviously,
and then became CBS.
I think they started with NBC.
That's right.
And so they got the goods. They had like a better spectrum, a higher frequency, and they got all the goods from NBC because they could also get more sponsors because they had better connections for and so broadcast quality, and so at WNO I think tanked after just a couple of years, and that's why people started leaving, going to WRAL, because they saw it's a kind of a silo story for being the first one in the area.
Right. Well, you hear people talk about a first mover advantage, but at the same time, that's the person who has to go out and make all the mistakes, and then someone else can stand on their shoulders and do it from the get-go. So
that's it.
Exactly.
That's history.
Yeah. And so as I was going through the collections, you could kind of tell. Well, he also, I think, as O.B. Garris stayed around and started to get a reputation, he got I wasn't able to find it in the registry, but his daughter said one of the governors gave him the Longleaf Pine civil service award, and then he didn't work on a lot of feature films, but he worked on one ridiculous one. It is ridiculously fantastic. It's not ridiculous.
Or fantastically ridiculous.
Fantastically ridiculous. Film, God, I'm gonna get in trouble for saying that. Called Somebody Move My Mountain, and he was one of the cinematographers on that, and that was a very local North Carolina based artist fest. A lot of musicians and artists produced it and were in it, and he was there and worked on that, and a couple of other sort of low budget things in the area. So I kind of feel and then his daughter said that in 1977 he'd been in the military, he'd been in Guadalcanal, was wounded in Guadalcanal, goes into television in the very early 50s after having been a photographer. In 1977, not even at that, maybe I'm not sure how long. Century was still making films into the early 80s. And in 77, he re-enlists in the Navy as a photographer's mate. And then I have in my scrawl chief. I'm not really sure what that meant as well. Maybe he became something else.
Chief something.
Chief something, yeah. So he's
sure it doesn't say chef.
Yeah. Oh, I know. I might actually.
A really good cook. You don't know.
I know. So there's he's a really interesting character, for sure.
Okay.
It's also interesting in some ways that this kind of also allows us to talk about kind of regional feature film production as well. I mean, I think it's interesting that Garris worked on a couple of feature films that were shot and kind of involved the community. But now, there's a lot of talk sort of critically about this idea of regional filmmaking and sort of how different regions are popping up as these sort of counter Hollywood sort of meccas for film production. Austin, Texas. We have a few directors of our own in the state of North Carolina.
Oh, we definitely have a pretty good scene going on here.
It's really good, and people for a little while were calling it Hollywood South. I don't think that they're doing that
I see the
quite
term
so much
Wilmington
anymore.
a lot.
Yeah.
Like to call Wilmington that.
Yeah. And so I feel like this is kind of, in some ways, this is the first. This is kind of the first step towards that kind of more regionalized thinking about film outside of Hollywood.
Yeah.
Right. So this is all really fascinating to think about. This time when everything was. This pre-tape, pre-cassette tapes, and pre-VHS tapes, and everything's on film. And you touched on it a little bit about how degraded everything was. And I find all this kind of fascinating. You're a professional archivist. Tell us a little bit about what that's like, because it sounds really interesting to be, digging around these boxes. Somebody hands you, I'm sure it's not quite this dramatic, but somebody hands you a box and says, what is this stuff? I've had it for years, or somebody gave this to me, or I found it in, my grandfather's attic when I was cleaning it out. And, who knows what the condition of it is? How do you go about, discovering what it is and cataloging and all that stuff? Hopefully preserving too.
Yeah. Before I go into that, let us not forget to remind you about Home Movie Day that's coming up like 4 days after our screening. And that is a great opportunity for people who don't have an opportunity to, or haven't donated their films or family films or a box of stuff. So we'll tell you about that. But so I have actually a lot of videotapes and audio cassettes as well. And so I'm definitely not a purist or fetishist about film. It's in this box. But
we're kind of purists.
I don't know. No, I'm actually,
we like film a lot. But.
Yeah, but I think that I'm a very big proponent of video being made sure that that's not, because it's actually it is deteriorating a lot faster than films are. I think films, everyone was rushing in the 70s and 80s and 90s. They were freaking out that film, and for sure, it was in the wrong conditions, films will deteriorate quickly and you're unable to get, but so does magnetic tape. Because some of the film elements in this collection was magnetic audio. And it's tricky. It's not, that stuff just comes right off.
Yeah, magnetic tape doesn't have its Martin Scorsese sort of fighting on its behalf.
It's like the found footage guys.
Right, those are that's really it, I think.
So yeah, sometimes it is literally opening. In this case, sometimes there would be, a piece of tape across the top, or on the leader, it would say, this is such and such, but you really don't know, because people would, like in this case, because it was a mom and pop shop, he would reuse the leader, because
sometimes you got to reuse your tape.
Yeah. And so I actually I definitely polled a lot of colleagues, and I was like, how is this weird? Like, he seems to be, because I didn't really know about the company yet. I was like, he seems to be reusing a lot of leader, and it's really throwing me off. It really is requiring that I look at every single bit of this, as you should anyway, because it hasn't been unpacked, taken out of the can in decades. And so you need to reel all the way through it and let it just have its moment, with oxygen again, and then reel it back up and stick it back in again. But you just don't know, like videotapes or audio tapes or film. Film is at least you can take it out and look at it. If you have a light source, you can look at it and you can say, okay. I mean, that's how I identified everything. Again, because of not feeling comfortable projecting them, it was a light box and a loop and just going through, and as I could tell, as you're reeling through a film, you can see a scene has changed. And so you'd stop and kind of look and see like what's new, what's changed, blow it up a little bit, and then just start looking on the internet, see if you can identify this stuff. There are also like codes along the side of film, depending on how far back it goes, but that was useful in this case. Sometimes it can help you date it. If it's if it's like reversal film versus this kind of film, you can kind of tell like, well, I know when these things came into being, this kind of stock started being used. So you can kind of, this was not the only way I was schooled, and so I'm equally happy and comfortable.
But it is kind of like film forensics in some ways,
right?
Like just sort of like trying to piece together, before you even get a chance to run it through a projector, trying to piece together what you're holding and sort of try and date it and figure out its history.
Don't trust the label.
Right? Yeah, don't trust the label.
Ever.
But I think it is really. It really is, and it's a really interesting, and I think now only beginning to be acknowledged part of kind of the film studies world is this aspect, this historical aspect of uncovering things that have just been neglected or have
what
been sitting.
Archivists have been doing for decades.
Yeah, exactly.
Like the film scholars are like, oh, this is really interesting. I'm like, yep, this is what is the people that you ask for favors or ignore, that that are in the archive, tucked away in the archives. This is how they know what's on your.
Yeah.
This is how they've uncovered things that you then get to go study. And so I guess I have a foot in both worlds a little bit. Is that I would work in a library and archive and find something super interesting, and then I would go research the hell out of it, and then go talk to people about it. I'm like, you have to. Like in conferences or symposiums or something like that, like, oh, I found something really groovy, and that tends to be that's where our worlds overlap. Is that we were both part of that community where people were looking at it from the history of film, and then there are people who are kind of like myself a little bit, because I took some of those classes too, but more also from the historical point of view. Like that's why I think the raw footage and the outtakes and the oral histories and stuff like that are really interesting for me, because it's like who was on the set that day, or who was, like who are the people you don't see behind the camera. I'm really interested in the crew as well as the cast, and that's the only time you ever get to see them. So but it was really just a box of stuff and and some mislabeled things, and for me still now, what the exciting part is that because we're doing this screening and because for the screening and for the class, we got a whole bunch of them, not everything, certainly, but we got a lot of things digitized. And that was kind of fun. So AV Geeks here in town, he did the digitization. I got to sit in and I got to do some hands-on digitization with him. And so that was really neat for me, because that's actually not where my skills lie, is that part of it. So that was really fun. Then I got to hear the audio, which helped me identify more people. So before we had the sound, I couldn't tell. And then as we could hear,
you're like, sure enough, that is Bob Hope.
Exactly.
I'm kidding.
But other things, I was like, no kidding. Okay, I didn't. Now that I can hear him talk, I know I can identify. So now when we go back after your students, we're giving them for the exhibit, giving them a project where they will take films and they will do more research than I did on it. Some individual films, not the company. That's still sort of I had a connection with the family, and I don't want to have a bunch of students, contacting the family, but individual films, they can get in the archives themselves and dig around and try to flesh out the description a bit more.
Right. So tell us a little, Devin, tell us a little bit about what you do. You're a professor at NC State, and how did you get involved in in Melissa's project of cataloging all this stuff, and how did you decide to use it in putting together this class? Sure.
Well, as you might be able to surmise, in some ways, this was kind of just serendipitous. It was, in some ways, I think Melissa was thinking in the back of her head, like, how can we get this out to the public, and how can we get the public involved? And a really good and useful first step was to sort of put it in the hands of my students, my graduate students this semester, who are taking a seminar with me on nonfiction film, documentary, kind of broadly defined. And so it was just a perfect opportunity to get them involved in sort of helping to identify some of the films, and do a little deeper research into some of the personalities and firms behind some of the films. And my area of specialization has shifted pretty frequently over the course of my career, but the past 10 or so years, I've been really focused in my career on non-theatrical film. And so really focused on educational film, advertising, promotional film, and this kind of material that I think is only now starting to be recognized in film and media studies. And it just sort of overlapped perfectly with this project, this sort of box full, as we're calling it, box full of films that Melissa had uncovered. So
box full of goodies.
Yeah, exactly. And so my students have known from the very beginning of the semester that at some point we were going to lay this project on them, and that work actually begins tomorrow night. And so Melissa and some other folks are coming to my class tomorrow night, and sort of showing the students the films and assigning certain films to certain students, and just letting them rip, letting them go to town on sort of figuring out what they can figure out about the films that they're assigned.
Okay.
Yeah. So, well,
I guess in that process, though, I don't know how much they already know, or are you going to actually have to show them a lot of those techniques for properly handling this antiquated, possibly already damaged.
They're not touching the films.
Oh yeah. In another course we taught together, they did do a little bit of hands-on, but in this case, we're actually giving them the digitized files, and it's really more about deep research. But so one of the people coming in is from the Special Collections Library at NC State, and then I'm going to talk about research in other parts of the Triangle, and how researching for audiovisual materials is such a trickier job than looking for books and magazines and manuscripts and things like that. It's because of the way audiovisual materials historically have been kind of an afterthought. Now, right. I think in the last, I don't know, 10 years maybe, there's been more of an effort to everyone just says digitize them. So once they digitize them, of course, then there are access copies, and people start thinking, well, now, God, what do we do with these? And how do you describe them? And that was all stuff I was taught in school. But how do you
now the public is becoming more aware of that.
And so how do you teach the students to, because of the heavy component that they have to do research in the Special Collections Library. It's not just going online. And I mean, sure, they'll find some things that way, obviously, but they have to go into the deep archives and find some stuff. And
I think one of the ideas that we're trying to convey is that, these are materials that were buried, and the way we're going to find out more about them is to look for other materials that are buried, whether those be, written documents or newspaper articles. It's not going to be obvious because the materials themselves, these are the primary materials. They weren't obvious. And so I think also
scattered all over the place. So somebody who has a crucial document might not even know it. It might be sitting in an attic or a basement somewhere.
That's precisely right.
Yeah, and a really great resource. So here's a dichotomy that happens when you go to look, because newspapers are a really fantastic way. I found a lot of stuff about these guys in the newspaper, but there's a cutoff. Like newspapers.com I found a ton of stuff that way. Usually stuff that got disseminated through AP, Associated Press, but the NNO, which is completely lost to me unless you go in to students and researchers, unless you go in and look through microfilm. And that's something that people aren't as jazzed about to claim. You know what I mean?
Right. It's not sexy. It doesn't.
Yeah. And you can sit,
it's labor.
And you can search newspapers.com, as I have done, in your pajamas, sitting there with your free trial run for a week, and you can go in there and just, for an entire evening, look for what you're looking for, and then your trial subscription's over, and you're like, okay, but you actually have to get up
for a minute, but
now you have to actually put on pants and go down during work hours to the state archives and ask them to look at the NNO collection prior to 1980, which is when these guys were in business.
Yeah.
And so that's different.
Okay.
Yeah.
We will make our students wear pants.
Yeah.
That's really the key.
Goal.
The goals of education have lowered.
You don't need to tell me, man.
So before we get to the actual event, since we're actually, I'm actually talking to archivists and everything, I'm curious, as a filmmaker myself and knowing a lot of filmmakers and this being a show for the filmmaking community, what are your thoughts on preservation of materials? Because a lot of us, obviously, we're working in digital right now, but and it's easy to think, oh, I'll just put it on a hard drive and stick it in the closet and it'll always be there. But hard drives can degrade and fail and everything.
So can closets.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
Closets can also fail. Don't smoke in bed, kids.
That's right.
It could be hazardous to your archive. But even if
yeah,
it'll cause hard drive fail too.
Yeah.
But even if the hard drive remains pristine, or if you store it on the cloud somehow, we're running now in the digital world into the problem of changing formats. And something that you did even a mere 10 years ago might be in a format that nothing these days can read. So what are your thoughts on people trying to preserve their work, and how you keep stuff around and in an accessible format?
Transfer everything to 16 millimeter.
Yeah, transfer all that. There's like enough. There actually is. There's always these parallel arguments about preserving back onto film. From your born digital media. But first of all, I mean, even starting from the basics. Make sure you make sure you have a file naming convention for all of your files so that you don't lose anything. That sounds like that's not very sexy terminology or way of thinking about preservation, but it's kind of step one. Well, actually step one is to keep it in a cool, dry place, even your hard drives and stuff like that. Like that's obvious for videotape and film, a cool, dry place, but even for the things that have to do with hard drives, like keeping them away from magnetic fields.
Not like humidity.
Yeah, humidity. But yeah, I would say when you said keep it on a hard drive or the cloud, you would save it on the hard drive and the cloud.
Yeah, redundancy.
And at your parents' house.
Redundancy is key. Yeah.
And then as far as the fact that things are migrating to newer formats, new file formats, and everything, new sparkly things, you just have to keep migrating it. That's a sad fact. And sometimes, if something, and make sure you migrate. There's some really great resources online. There's a, I don't have the URL in front of me, but I could certainly offer it. There are talks, the Library of Congress have these personal archiving talks, and a couple of them are more digital format experts. And so they're really useful. And so even though they're talking about personal archiving, that kind of is your personal archive as well, but it's a good resource to kind of go and see what people are doing.
It raises an interesting question though, because our advice for when we do home movie day, for instance, is always, get your stuff digitized. That's obviously it's a great way to sort of have access to the material, but hang on to the original, because that's the source material, and it has this kind of intrinsic value. But I wonder if as digital formats change, is that advice still the same? I mean, should people that are saving their material and trying to keep up with digital formats, should they also keep the previous formats?
Yeah, you should. And that was one of the things that I learned on one of these really great talks that the Library of Congress was offering, was that you really you articulate somewhere, or you keep a record somewhere of all of the metadata that came off your camera was embedded into your file. Keep a record of all that stuff, because it's gonna stuff is obviously, as you're saying, constantly changing. But if you identify how it came out of the camera and everything that was embedded in that file, somebody in the future will have an emulator, and they will go back and just like they're doing with video games now, going back and they're going to emulate that. They'll be able to extract based on the metadata that you have identified from the time you took it, the time you shot it. Without that, it's hard. I mean, they can do, but it's easier if you if you are keeping track of that yourself.
Right.
And when you start listening to like this woman Linda Tadich about when she starts going on about this, you're like, why would anybody do that? But if you want to keep your stuff, if you're a maker and you want to keep your material, like it sounds like for a home, for an amateur home videographer, they're gonna be like, oh my god, that is the last thing. Like I also have to do the dishes, and we're going on vacation, and like how am I gonna sit down on a spreadsheet, like do this fine grain and bits of information about what I've been doing. But in your case, you would want to do that because that's your work,
well, and especially when you're talking about high definition video, that fills up terabytes and terabytes of hard drives pretty quickly, and it's easy for someone to say, that's a lot of space to be tied up with stuff that I'm not using anymore. But like you said, that you got to hold on to that stuff somehow.
If you ever want to make it, I mean, if it's important to you that you just made it once. And if, depending on what your relationship is to your work, if you make it once and it's out there in the world and you don't care what happens to it after that, you're like, I made it, people saw it, I'm done.
It did its work.
It did its work. Then you have a different relationship, but if to your work, people just have to kind of think about that, like what's important.
But at the same time, I mean, the excitement that we feel in discovering this treasure trove of Century films, if Garris had been keeping up, right, and were sort of didn't really care about the longevity or the legacy of the material that he shot, he would have followed trend, right, and switched to video and thrown all the film out, and we wouldn't be talking about this. We wouldn't be looking at it. And believe me, there's some amazing footage of Raleigh from the 50s through the 70s that isn't found anywhere else. And so this is really valuable material that people don't think about.
And what this guy Grady, I love this guy. What he talks about too is that there was a lot of live programming on these early television stations. And like, in fact, talking to Garris's daughter, she said, I remember going down after school to taping these live after school programs like Captain Kangaroo kind of thing, but local. She's like, I remember going down and do that. And this guy, that's something that you kind of learn about in television history, but he kind of says it again, which is that nobody was videotaping even, because they did have it, because WRL did invest, this guy says, in a couple of very expensive videotape.
3/4 inch.
2 inch.
Oh wow.
For editing purposes. They had one just to record what they were doing, what they were airing, and then another, they did another one so they could edit. And he was saying so much of that early live or just local productions are just gone because, and I think O.B. Garris is like, dude, I shot that, I'm taking it home, like, and then 16 millimeter was a little bit, you didn't have to, tape was very expensive. And so there was no way to reuse it. So I think I don't know, but I think I know a couple of these things.
He might have liberated.
I think he was like, I made this. This is my reel. This is my reel, and
it's my portfolio.
I'm taking it home. Yeah. And so I don't know, but I guess that's what happened.
Right. Well, it's funny, like you're talking about. I know that there are a lot of shows like old Ed Sullivan and Johnny Carson episodes that they just either they never recorded because it was live and they figured that was it, or they just went and recorded over the tapes because they never thought that there would be any use for the posterity of this stuff. It's a phenomenon Doctor Who fans are very familiar.
Yeah.
There are entire
seasons really
of Doctor Who that are gone because they just recorded over those tapes with newer episodes, and whole episodes are gone. So
exactly. So it's pretty fun when those things when one tape
pop up,
they pop up. That's actually part of the fun of being an archivist, because every once in a while, like if you work on somebody's collection and they were on something, like they were on like I did a lot of research in public access television in New York, and these are just, if they were on TV like one time or something, or whatever, they will get a tape of it. Like they will ask for their own copy, so that's how I discovered, or that's how I was able to hunt down stuff I was looking for, tapes I was looking for, episodes of just random public access television shows. It just happened to be that like this mime is going to be on this show, and so he has a reel of his own.
Ask the Mime.
Ask the Mime, yeah.
And the network probably didn't think it was a big enough deal to hold on to it, so that episode is lost, except the guy who was on there got himself a copy.
Who had a family member put tape in and make sure they got a copy of it. So that's what you end up with in boxes. That's how TV history has been saved in some cases, because somebody was like, I was on that episode. I was the first comedian to be on that talk show, and I want to have a copy of that. And it's,
Right. I remember it was probably a year or two ago, I saw something that really kind of blew my mind, because you think like with digital stuff, you copy a file from here to here and it's an exact replica. And that's kind of what you get in your head. And I saw a YouTube video that somebody made where they made a video, just a short little like 5-second thing, and they uploaded it to YouTube. And then they downloaded it from YouTube. And then they took that and uploaded it to YouTube. And then
I think I heard about this.
They did that back and forth. I want to say it was not quite 100 times. And by the time they had finished, it was just a fuzzy gray box and sound. And you think,
that's a great exercise.
I thought they were, you think this digital stuff, holds up its fidelity, but in some cases, not all that much better. That's again another reason to hold on to your original source material, because it has the highest fidelity, and you can always, even better than re-encoding from one conversion up to the newest codec or whatever. If you can make future copies from the original, you'll always have the highest quality version.
That's the case across the board.
Right.
Across the board for anything you're working in, that original. Yeah, that's funny. I'd heard about that experiment, but I didn't watch it. I totally want to go check that out. There are.
That's what we're doing after this.
Yeah, exactly. I'm having a moment right now where I can't remember what this procedure is called, and it's embarrassing. But there is a way where a checksum, and there is a way that you can run. You can do a checksum on your files to see if all the ones and zeros are in the right place. All the codes in the right place. It's not actually ones and zeros, but all the codes in the right place. And you can tell if a number is, if it's, because you're comparing, like DNA, you're comparing two exact,
basically images.
A bit of data, and if one of them's off, then you'll see it, and you'll go back to this one and make a new copy. And if these are exact, then But like that's something that people developed over a while for those kinds of things. But,
okay, that's good for checking out.
Libraries use that a lot to make sure.
Okay.
Libraries are migrating.
Well, cool. Well, there you go, folks. We have a little advice for you from professional archivists, how to preserve your data and your work.
Yeah, but seriously, go online and go to Library of Congress and look at their personal archiving resources. They're really great and very much flexible to people's different needs.
Yeah. There you go. Yeah, if you get, send me a link to that, I'll put it in the show notes.
Cool. Yeah.
Look that up. Yeah. But anyways, the whole reason, the whole thing that got us together is you guys are going to be screening some of Century Film's work on October 13th. And then, of course, like I mentioned at the beginning of the show, there will then be an exhibit in the library at NC State of their work. So go ahead and tell people a little bit about that and how they can attend the event.
Well, the event is at the Hunt Library at NC State. It's free and it's open to the public. There's lots and lots of parking. We have a Facebook presence. Yeah, we have a Facebook presence. It's called Local History Through the Camera Lens. And folks should pop in and like us on Facebook and
starts at 7.
Yeah, it starts at 7 o'clock. Okay. And there's going to be a group of people there. Melissa and I obviously will be there. Skip Elsheimer of AV Geeks will be there. And Kim Anderson of the North Carolina State Archives will be there. And our sort of duty in this is primarily to try and contextualize some of the materials that might otherwise remain rather mysterious, but also to facilitate discussion, because a lot of what we're going to be showing, in order to identify it, in order to figure out what we're looking at, we need some audience participation. People are going to be able to recognize things in some of these films that we can't recognize. Yeah. And so this is sort of like it's like grassroots style research and cataloging from our perspective.
You're crowdsourcing your.
That's
exactly.
it. Live crowdsourcing.
There's going to be like a program, and before each clip or before each group of clips, there's going to be a number, and so you can like make notes or whatever, or like at the end of the show, be like, number 5, that's totally my grandfather, or whatever. Like that would be. I'm really hoping that kind of stuff happens.
Yeah.
So it's not. So it's not just come and watch and see cool stuff that you've never seen before. People can, people may actually be able to help you out in cataloging and identifying this stuff.
That's our hope, and that's really exactly our hope, and that's also really one of the points of the exhibit space also, which is also in the Hunt Library. It's in the lobby of Hunt Library. It's going to run all through the month of November and probably stay on their system in perpetuity. And sort of the idea is, again, for just people passing through the library that have any interest in this, it's for them to sort of engage with it, interact, and maybe see if they recognize anything as well. And this is also, frankly, it's the philosophy behind Home Movie Day as well, which is also
4 days later.
4 days later on October 17th,
Okay.
1 to 4 at the State Archives. And it's the same deal. It's basically, we like to crowdsource information and try and figure out what we're looking at, because more often than not, people that bring in home movies for Home Movie Day have no idea what's on the reel. They have no idea what has been in this shoebox since the 1950s. And so we project it, they can identify people, and more often than not, people in the crowd can identify the place. And it's a really exciting event.
And that is actually a situation we talked about, like in the archives process in the Century Film, that we didn't just throw it on the projector. In this case, you sign a waiver and we do throw it on the projector, and the whole audience gets to see your home movies.
Yeah.
Which is pretty great.
So keep it tame.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Yeah. Put those ones under your bed. Bring the birthday parties.
Right.
Well, and something else that you kind of lose context for these days, because it's so easy to just take pictures or shoot video. People do it pretty willy-nilly.
Yeah.
But back in the day when you had to actually load a reel of film into a very expensive camera that most people couldn't afford, or photography was a lot more difficult to do. Those materials that when someone actually did that stuff, it was of something important.
That's right.
So if your parents or grandparents have a box of old videotapes or 16 millimeter reels or old photographs that aren't developed, it's probably not them taking pictures of their dinner every night like you do when you put it on Twitter. It's probably actually, maybe a historical event, like a Christmas parade or a inaugural parade or some other, noteworthy event that's really worth documenting. Not that your dinner isn't worth documenting, but...
And there might be a dinner, but around that dinner will be the uncle you've never met.
Right.
Or your grandpa.
Or it's like a Seder dinner or something.
Or something. Or just, your grandpa your parents when they were young. Mm-hmm. And you were like, oh, gosh. Or younger than you knew them, But yeah, no, that's precisely.
Yeah. So definitely worth, holding on to that stuff and taking care of it. And of course, like you said, on October 17th, the home video day where people can bring their stuff in, and possibly even add it into the archive. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's actually called Home Movie Day, but you are encouraged.
Day, I'm sorry.
Yeah, but you can bring video. So I wanted to make sure that people did that. Yeah.
Okay. Well, awesome. Thank you guys very much for taking the time to talk to me. It's been almost an hour, but I couldn't cut it short. It's all really good information, and you guys have a lot of cool stuff to share. So
outstanding.
Thank you for taking the time to talk to me. For everybody out there, the Facebook group is Local History Through the Camera Lens. Go there, like it, follow up on the event. This screening of the Century Film footage will be on October 13th at 7 p.m. at the Hunt Library at NC State. Can you say anything about the specific films that you'll be showing?
We're showing one film in its entirety because it's sort of the jewel in the crown of the Century collection. Mm-hmm. So we're showing the State Fair film in its entirety.
It's been preserved.
What year is that from?
74. And a guy And I found one of the guys who's in it. He's the voice. He's the
And
narrator.
he's going to try and be there.
And he's the MC and the narrator. And I found him, and I was like, "There's only got to be one Homer Foyle in all of North Carolina." He's like, "That's me." So I'm really hoping he comes. Yeah.
Cool.
But other materials as well. We're showing some of the
Campaign
footage from
ads.
the police films.
Boy Scout footage. Really
pickles.
beautiful
Lots
Boy
of
Scout
pickles.
footage. Lots of pickles.
And pickles.
Yeah.
But for people
Police
who are
pickles.
yeah.
It's like the fair.
Punching? No, I'm not punching. If you're interested in different film formats and stuff, there's some beautiful Kodachrome 16 millimeter footage of this Boy Scout Okinichi Boy Scout troop here from Wake County from the 50s.
It's incredible footage.
It's really beautiful, and that didn't even have to be preserved. It's mostly outtakes. The archives has it's an entirety on videotape.
Okay.
It doesn't look nearly as beautiful as the footage. So even coming and watching it in silence, in silence is really like worth it.
Yeah,
Oh, it does sound cool.
Yeah.
Awesome. So everybody, everybody watching or listening, put that on your calendar and definitely try to head out. Who knows? You might be able to identify somebody in one of the films and, help add to the historical record.
Yeah.
So that's very cool.
Please do.
Well, thank you guys again for coming and chatting with me.
Thank you.
Again, we have Melissa Dollman and Devin Orgeron. Did I get that right again?
You got it exactly right.
2 for 2. That's definitely a record for me.
It's better than me.
But I really appreciate you guys taking the time to talk to me. Keep us updated on, if there are any more developments or any more events you guys have going on. And just keep us posted on what you've got going on, because it sounds really cool.
Will do.
Thank you.
Thanks
Thanks
a lot.
for doing what you're doing.
Oh, thank you. I'm just trying to, I know a lot of people doing stuff in the area, and I just try to help them get the word out about what they're doing, which is, exactly what you guys are looking for. The more people who participate in this, the more you can add to the record.
And Richard, the more voices there are in the community.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much. Thank you,
Thanks.
everyone, for listening and watching, and we will see you next week.
Thanks.
Bye.